"Can you be my son?" the old woman whispered. "Just for one day." 6 bikers went absolutely silent. Not one of them moved. Not one of them breathed. The whole diner froze like someone had reached in and stopped time with their bare hands. Iron Bear, 6'2", 240 pounds of road and iron and decades of hard living, felt something he hadn't felt since he was 9 years old, standing at his mother's grave. He felt small, and he felt chosen. If this story moves you, and it will, subscribe to our channel right now and drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that notification bell and stay with us until the very end. You will not regret it. The Rusty Spoon Diner had seen better decades. It sat at the edge of Callaway, Tennessee, population 4,000, and shrinking where the 2-lane highway bent west toward nothing in particular, and the mountains in the distance looked close enough to touch, but never actually got any closer, no matter how far you drove. The sign out front had lost the letter S from spoon sometime during the second Bush administration, and nobody had ever replaced it. The coffee was bad. The pie was extraordinary. And on Tuesday mornings, Margaret Whitmore had the corner booth by the window every single week, without exception, for 11 years running. She was 89 years old. She had blonde hair gone silver white that she still set with rollers every Sunday night, the way her mother had taught her when Eisenhower was president. She wore a pale blue cardigan over a white blouse with pearl buttons, and her hands folded on the table around a coffee cup she barely touched were the hands of a woman who had planted gardens, raised children, buried a husband, and held on through things that would have broken most people before they turned 50. Her posture was straight. It was always straight. Even now, even when the rest of her body had started the long, slow argument with gravity that none of us win, she sat like a woman who believed that how you held yourself told the world everything it needed to know about who you were. Vera, the Tuesday morning waiter, who'd worked the Rusty Spoon for going on 19 years, always topped off Margaret's coffee without being asked, and always said, "Cold enough out there for you, Miss Margaret," regardless of what month it was, because it was the thing she said. And Margaret always laughed like it was the first time she'd heard it, because Margaret was the kind of woman who understood that kindness had its own language, and part of speaking it fluently was receiving it graciously. But that particular Tuesday, the last week of February, with a gray sky pressing down on the valley like it had somewhere to be, Vera noticed something different. Margaret wasn't reading. She always read. She brought a book in her purse, something from the library 2 towns over, and she'd read 3 or 4 pages over coffee before the breakfast rush thinned out, and she'd leave a $4 tip on a $7 tab and walk the 6 blocks home. But today, the book was still in her purse. Her hands were wrapped around the coffee cup, and her eyes were fixed on the door. Not the way a woman waits for a friend. The way a woman waits for something she's already dreading. "You expecting someone today?" Vera asked, sliding into the pause between a refill and the next table. "I'm hoping for a miracle," Margaret said quietly, and preparing for the alternative. Vera didn't know what to make of that. She started to say something, thought better of it, and went back to the counter. 12 minutes later, the alternative drove into the parking lot. Not Daniel Pierce. Not yet. Something else. 7 motorcycles, one after another, turned off the highway and into the gravel lot outside the Rusty Spoon, and the sound of them hit the diner before they did a low, rolling thunder that climbed through the walls and got into your chest and squeezed. One by one, the conversations inside the diner stopped. A man in a John Deere cap turned toward the window, saw what was coming, and turned back around very quickly. A young mother, 2 booths down, reached across and pulled her 8-year-old son a little closer without saying a word. The short order cook, a big quiet man named Gerald, who had cooked in this diner for 22 years, and startled at nothing, leaned slightly over the pass-through window and looked. Then he stepped back from the window. The door opened. The first one through was 6'2" and built like a man who had decided a long time ago that the world was going to have to accommodate him, not the other way around. He wore a black leather vest, sleeveless, despite the February cold, over a gray thermal long sleeve, and the back of the vest had the patch that every person in that diner recognized, even if they'd never seen it up close in their lives. White background, red lettering, and the word that needed no explanation. Rex Dalton, road name Iron Bear, president of the Hells Angels, Tennessee. Chapter 31 years riding a man whose name had been spoken in courtrooms and whispered in hospital waiting rooms, and said out loud by very few people who didn't already know him well. He came through the door and he looked around the diner the way you look around any room, when you've learned through experience that left marks to know your exits. Behind him came the others, 5 more different shapes and sizes, all wearing the same vest. Darnell Hammer Briggs, who was 6 feet and built like a door and had a scar on his jaw from something nobody asked about. Cole Preacher Weston, who was thin and quiet and watched everything from under the brim of a dark baseball cap. Tommy Torch Adkins, youngest of the group, 26, with a red beard and the kind of energy that made him look like he was about to either laugh or start something. Victor Stone Navarro, who said almost nothing under any circumstances, but whose presence in a room had a weight to it that didn't need words. And at the end, Big Mac Roy McAllister, who was the oldest of them at 59, and moved with the deliberate ease of a man who had long since made his peace with who he was and what he did and what people thought about it. They took the big booth in the middle of the diner, not the one in the corner, not tucked away, the one right in the middle where everyone could see them. Vera stood at the counter and held very still for a moment. Then she picked up her order pad because that was her job, and she walked over. "Morning," she said. Her voice was steady. "Coffee for the table." "Please," Iron Bear said. And then because he noticed the way she was holding herself, he added, "We're just passing through, not here for anything but breakfast." Vera nodded. "I'll get that coffee started." The diner had not resumed its noise. Not yet. Conversations that had stopped were still stopped. The young mother was still holding her son close. The man in the John Deere cap was staring very intently at his eggs, and then one chair scraped back, slowly, deliberately. Vera heard it and looked. Margaret Whitmore had pushed herself to standing. All 89 years of her, 5 feet 3 inches, maybe 112 pounds, with her coat on pearl buttons and silver hair, and hands that trembled slightly with the particular tremor of age. And she was standing up straight in that corner booth, and she was looking directly at the bikers in the middle of the room. Vera took a step toward her. "Miss Margaret." "I'm fine, dear." Margaret's voice was soft but clear. "I know what I'm doing." She didn't. Nobody in that room could have possibly known what she was doing, but she started walking toward the bikers anyway. The diner got quieter than it already was, which should not have been physically possible, and yet somehow it was. Every eye in the place tracked Margaret Whitmore as she crossed the 12 feet of linoleum floor between her corner booth and the big table in the middle, and every single person in that room, every single one, was holding their breath. Iron Bear saw her coming. He watched her the whole way. His face did not change. He had a face built for not changing, a face that had learned over many decades to give away precisely what he chose to give away and nothing more. But he watched her, and something behind his eyes sharpened. She stopped at the edge of the table. 6 big men looked at her. She looked back. And then Margaret Whitmore, who had grown up in Callaway and married Robert Whitmore at 19 and raised 4 children in the house on Sycamore Road and planted marigolds every spring for 60 years and said grace before every meal and never once in her life used a word stronger than damn. And not even that, unless she was very provoked, leaned slightly forward. And in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Can you be my son just for one day?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing any person in that diner had ever heard. Iron Bear did not move, not for a full 3 seconds, maybe 4. He sat there with his hands flat on the table and looked at this tiny ancient woman in her blue cardigan, and something in his face, something he hadn't shown a room full of people in a very long time, shifted. "Ma'am." His voice came out quieter than he intended. "I know how this sounds," Margaret said. "I know what I look like. I know what you look like. And I know that none of this makes any sense." She paused. "But I need help, and in about 20 minutes, I'm going to run out of time to ask for it." For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Hammer spoke from the far end of the booth. "Lady, you should maybe sit down." "I'll sit down when someone agrees to help me," Margaret said with a politeness so absolute it landed harder than an argument would have. Iron Bear looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked at his table. Then he looked back at her. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me what's happening." So she didn't sit across from them. She sat next to Iron Bear, which was not what anyone expected, and she set her hands on the table and she started to talk, and what came out was not the fragile confessional of a frightened old woman. It was the clear, organized account of someone who had been living inside a nightmare long enough to know every room of it. "My nephew's name is Daniel Pierce," she said. "He's my late sister's son. He's a lawyer, a good one, which makes him very good at certain things that lawyers shouldn't be good at. Like what? Preacher asked from under the bill of his cap. Like making paperwork look like kindness. She told them. She told them about 6 months ago when Daniel had started calling first, just checking in. He'd said just making sure she was okay. She was 89 and living alone, and of course family should check in. She'd thought it was nice. She'd told her daughter Ellen it was nice. Ellen had agreed cautiously because none of them knew Daniel well. He'd spent most of his adult life in Nashville, and before that, Atlanta and Margaret had maybe seen him 4 times in the last decade. But the calls got more frequent, and they got more, she searched for the right word, administrative. He started asking about her doctors, her medications, whether she was having any trouble with the stairs, whether she'd had any falls, whether she remembered things the way she used to. I remember everything the way I used to, Margaret said, and there was a flash of something in her eyes that was not fragility at all. I remember what Daniel said on our first call 6 months ago, and I remember what he said last Tuesday, and I remember every single thing in between. Then came the first document. A medical evaluation form. Daniel had explained just something to have on file, just something her insurance company apparently needed. Could she sign here? And here it was routine, he said. Very standard. She'd barely looked at it because Daniel was explaining it as she signed it, and he was good at explaining things in a way that moved you forward without giving you time to stop and read. Iron Bear was very still while she talked. His eyes hadn't left her face. What was actually in the form, he asked. I don't know everything, Margaret said. But I found out 2 weeks ago that what I signed included a statement attesting that I had been evaluated by a physician and found to have significant cognitive decline. She folded her hands on the table. I have not been evaluated by any physician. Not for that. Not recently. And the physician's signature? Preacher asked. He'd leaned forward now, his cap tilted back. I assume it exists, Margaret said. Daniel is thorough. The table went quiet again. A different kind of quiet than before. There's more, Margaret said. Tell me, Iron Bear said. Oh, the power of attorney had come 3 weeks later. She'd known by that point to be more careful. Or she'd thought she'd known. But Daniel had arrived in person for that one, not a phone call, not a mailed document. He'd come to her house with flowers and a casserole he'd picked up from somewhere, and he'd sat with her for 2 hours talking about Robert, her late husband, and about her sister Carol, his mother who'd been gone 12 years now, and by the end of it, Margaret had felt for the first time in a long time like she had family nearby. He's good at that, she said, at making you feel seen right before he takes something from you. She'd signed the power of attorney. It was supposed to be limited, he'd explained, just for financial decisions if she was incapacitated. Just a precaution, just in case. What it actually gave Daniel Pierce, according to the attorney, Margaret had finally consulted 2 weeks ago quietly without telling Daniel, was broad authority over her financial affairs that could be activated by the medical evaluation she had already signed, which declared her cognitively impaired, which meant the mechanism was already in place. She had signed the trigger and the gun. The house, Iron Bear said. It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded. The house on Sycamore Road. My husband built it. We raised 4 children in it. It's paid off and it sits on 6 acres, and according to the county assessor, it's worth $430,000. She said the number plainly without drama. Daniel has already found a buyer, a developer from Knoxville who wants to put up a subdivision. Does he have the authority to sell it? Preacher asked. With the power of attorney active and a psychiatric evaluation on record declaring me incompetent, yes. Margaret's voice was steady. The attorney I spoke to said Daniel has built a clean legal structure. She said the best outcome in court would take 2 years and cost more than I have in savings. Torch, the youngest one, the one with the red beard, who had been quiet through all of this, suddenly said, "What does he want you to sign today?" Margaret looked at him. The transfer documents. The actual deed transfer. He wants me to sign the house over directly. He says it's to protect me from inheritance taxes. She paused. He's coming here. He knows I come here every Tuesday. He knew I'd be here. Another pause, smaller. He told me to have my reading glasses. Stone, who had said nothing until this moment, said one word, "Why here?" Because he thinks I'm more likely to comply somewhere public, Margaret said. He thinks I won't make a scene. He spent 6 months teaching me to feel small. She straightened slightly. He miscalculated. Vera had been refilling coffee around the table 3 times already. She'd stopped pretending she wasn't listening. Iron Bear noticed. He looked up at her. "You know her?" he asked. Vera looked at Margaret. Margaret gave a small nod. "I've known her 11 years, Vera said. She's in here every Tuesday." She set the coffee pot down on the table edge. "And I've known something was wrong for 2 months. She started coming in looking—" Vera shook her head. "She's not a woman who looks scared. Margaret Whitmore is not a scared woman. But 2 months ago, she started checking the parking lot every time the door opened." "You didn't ask her about it," Hammer said. "I asked her 4 times, Vera said. She said she was fine." She looked at Margaret with something that was not quite exasperation and not quite admiration, but lived right between them. "She's stubborn." "I was protecting you," Margaret said calmly. "Daniel asked questions about people I was close to. I didn't want him to know about you." Vera stared at her for a moment. "Miss Margaret, I'm 34 years old, and I've got a brother who used to fight professionally. And I appreciate that," Margaret said. "But a fist doesn't help when the weapon is a notary stamp." Iron Bear almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but it came close, and it changed his face in a way that made him look for just a fraction of a second like someone's son. "How long?" he asked. "Until he gets here." Margaret checked the small watch on her wrist. 15 minutes, maybe less." "Okay." Iron Bear leaned back. He looked at his table. Something passed between him and the other 5 men. Not words, just the particular fluency of people who have ridden together long enough to have their own language. Hammer gave a slight nod. Stone said nothing, but he settled his weight differently in the booth, the way a man settles when he's decided he's not moving. Preacher pulled his cap back down. Torch looked at the door and then back at Iron Bear. "Big Mac," the oldest, said. "You sure about this, Rex?" Iron Bear looked at Margaret. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to need you to tell me 2 more things." "All right," she said. "First, has Daniel Pierce done anything that breaks a law, not gray area, actually breaks a law?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "The medical evaluation is fraudulent. I was never assessed by the doctor whose name is on it. I know this because I called his office. He's a real doctor. He has no record of seeing me." "That's fraud," Preacher said quietly. "Medical fraud and document fraud." "Yes," Margaret said. "Second question," Iron Bear said. "What do you actually want from us?" She looked at him. "I want someone to sit beside me who isn't afraid of him," she said. "I've been afraid of him for 6 months. I don't want to be afraid of him anymore." She paused. "And I want witnesses, people he can't intimidate, people who will remember exactly what happens in this diner today." Iron Bear looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Slide over. I beg your pardon. Slide over, ma'am. You're in the aisle seat. Slide toward the window. I'm sitting next to you." Margaret slid toward the window. Iron Bear got up from the big table and sat down across from the door next to the 89-year-old woman in the blue cardigan, and he folded his tattooed arms on the tabletop and looked at the door. The rest of them redistributed. Hammer and Stone took the booth directly behind the seat facing the door. Preacher and Torch moved to the counter stools with sightlines to the entrance. Big Mac stayed at the big table but rotated his position so he was facing in. The diner was watching all of this happen. Nobody was pretending not to anymore. Vera went back to the counter. She picked up the coffee pot. She set it back down. She picked up the phone behind the counter instead, and she dialed quietly. And when someone picked up, she said in a low voice, "I need to speak to someone about a situation. It's not an emergency right now, but I think it might become one." Margaret watched her do this. She didn't say anything. Iron Bear watched the door. "You haven't told me your name," Margaret said. "Rex," he said. "People call me Iron Bear. Which do you prefer?" He thought about it. "Rex from people I sit next to." "Rex," she said. "My name is Margaret, Margaret Whitmore." "I know," he said. "Vera said it." "Are you married, Rex?" The question landed sideways and he looked at her. "I was. She passed 7 years ago." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and she meant it the way only people who have lost someone actually mean it. "Kids?" she asked. Something moved across his face. "A son. We don't—" He stopped. "We haven't talked in a while." "I'm sorry for that too," Margaret said. "That's its own kind of loss." He didn't respond to that, but he didn't look away from her either. "Why us?" he asked after a moment. "You could have called the police, a lawyer, your children." "I called a lawyer," she said. "She told me 2 years in my savings. I called my daughter Ellen, and she started crying, and I realized I was trying to comfort her when I was the one who needed comfort. And the police, she paused. He hasn't done anything they can see yet. That's why he's good at what he does. Nothing is visible until it's finished. And us. You walked into the room and the room changed, Margaret said simply. I needed the room to change. Iron Bear looked at the door. There's something else, he said. It wasn't a question. Margaret was quiet for a moment. My son James died 4 years ago, she said. He was 61, heart attack. Her voice didn't break, but it went somewhere else for just a second. He was the one who checked on things. He was the one who would have seen Daniel coming. He was the one who would have sat right where you're sitting. She looked down at her hands. I've been on my own for 4 years, and I kept thinking James would have known what to do. James would have handled it. And then last week I realized that wasn't helping me. So I stopped thinking about what James would have done, and I started thinking about what I needed. And what did you need? Iron Bear asked. Someone who wouldn't flinch, Margaret said. Someone Daniel couldn't predict. Someone with nothing to lose from looking him in the eye. A car turned into the parking lot outside. They both heard the tires on gravel. Margaret's hands, which had been still on the table, tightened slightly against each other. Iron Bear noticed. Hey, he said. She looked at him. You asked me to be your son for one day. Yes, she said. What kind of son, he said, lets his mother sit in the aisle seat? She looked at him. He reached over and gently moved her coffee cup closer to her. You're fine, he said. He walks through that door, and all he's going to see is breakfast. The door handle moved. Margaret Whitmore looked at the man beside her, this stranger with his ink-covered arms and his road name, and his 31 years of a life she couldn't imagine, and she did something that surprised her. She exhaled, not the careful, controlled breath of a woman managing her fear. The real thing, the breath that comes out when you have been holding it for so long, you forgot it was held. The door opened, and Daniel Pierce walked into the Rusty Spoon Diner. He was 52 years old, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had learned to weaponize appearance. The suit was charcoal gray and well cut without being flashy. The shoes were polished. His hair was gray at the temples in a way that photographs well and looks trustworthy. He carried a leather folder under his left arm, the kind that says, I've done my homework, and his face as he came through the door and scanned the room carried the particular expression of a man who was already deciding how the next hour was going to go. He found Margaret. He started toward the corner booth. He got halfway there before he registered what he was seeing. He stopped. His eyes moved from Margaret to the man sitting next to her, down to the vest, to the patch, back up to the face. Then around the room quickly, and he saw Hammer and Stone in the booth behind, and he saw Preacher and Torch at the counter, and he saw Big Mac at the big table, and he understood with the sudden sick certainty of a man whose plan has encountered reality that something had gone very wrong with his Tuesday morning. He recovered fast. That was what made him dangerous. He recovered inside 2 seconds, and he crossed the remaining distance to the booth, and he put a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes, and he said, Aunt Margaret, I didn't know you had friends joining you today. Sit down, Daniel, Margaret said. He looked at Iron Bear. Iron Bear looked back at him, said nothing. Daniel pulled a chair from the nearest empty table and sat at the end of the booth, not in it. A subtle thing, keeping his exits. I see you're enjoying breakfast, Daniel said. He was recalibrating in real time, which was impressive, and also, if you were watching, closely frightening in its own way. I am, Margaret said. Daniel, this is Rex. He's a friend. Daniel looked at Rex. A friend, he repeated. A close friend, Margaret said. I see. Daniel opened his leather folder slowly and laid it on the table. Well, I don't want to take up your morning. I just need a few minutes with Aunt Margaret, if you don't mind. Some family paperwork. He produced a pen, a good pen, the kind of pen that says, this is already decided. What kind of paperwork? Iron Bear said. His voice was completely even, not aggressive, not warm, just a question. Daniel looked at him. Family business. She's family, Iron Bear said. So it's my business. The silence stretched. Daniel looked at Margaret. His smile stayed on his face. It was detached from the rest of him, the smile like something he'd borrowed and forgotten to return. Aunt Margaret, he said, his voice dropping, going gentle. I think your friend might feel more comfortable waiting at another table while we He stays, Margaret said. It was the same soft voice she'd used to ask the impossible question that had started all of this. But there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there 6 months ago, when Daniel had first started making her feel small. She'd borrowed it from somewhere, from 6 men who had walked into a room and let the room change around them. He stays, she said again. Whatever you need to say, you say in front of him. Daniel Pierce looked at Margaret Whitmore, and for the first time, just the first glimmer of it, barely enough to see the predator in the charcoal suit, understood that something in this equation had changed. He just didn't know yet how completely. He set the pen on top of the leather folder and folded his hands. All right then, he said. Let's talk about the house. Iron Bear reached forward and picked up his coffee cup. He took a slow sip, and he waited. Daniel Pierce had a way of talking that made you feel like you were being helped, even when you were being taken apart. Iron Bear recognized it inside the first 30 seconds. He'd met men like Daniel before, not in courtrooms, not in boardrooms, but in the particular places where men who use words as weapons end up when the words stop working. He'd seen what was left of the people those men passed through. He'd seen it in his own family once a long time ago, and the memory of it sat in the back of his chest like a coal that never fully went cold. Daniel opened the leather folder, slowly. The way a man opens something when he wants you to feel the weight of what's inside before you ever see it. The transfer document is straightforward, Daniel said. His voice was the voice of a man explaining something to someone who probably won't understand it, but he was going to be patient about that. It moves the property on Sycamore Road into a family trust, one I've already set up on Aunt Margaret's behalf, which protects it from estate taxes and ensures that when the time comes, there's no legal confusion about distribution. Whose name is on the trust? Iron Bear asked. Daniel looked at him. It's a family trust. The beneficiaries are family members. That's not what I asked. A beat. I'm the named trustee. So you control it. I manage it on her behalf. Same thing, Iron Bear said. Daniel's smile didn't move. It was architectural now, that smile. Load-bearing. I understand how it might look that way to someone not familiar with the state law. I'm not talking about estate law, Iron Bear said. I'm talking about the word control. You control it. Yes or no? The diner was very quiet. Gerald the cook had stopped making noise in the kitchen. Vera was standing at the far end of the counter with a dish towel in her hand that she was not using. Daniel turned back to Margaret. He shifted the folder slightly, angling it toward her away from Iron Bear. A subtle redirect. Almost unconscious. Almost. Aunt Margaret, I've spent 4 months putting this together. I've worked with 2 different estate attorneys. This is designed to protect you. From what? Margaret asked. Daniel blinked. I'm sorry. From what specifically does this protect me? She looked at the document without touching it. I own the house. It's paid off. Robert and I paid it off in 1987. I have no debt. My children are not disputing anything. So from what exactly does this protect me? Daniel paused. Just a half-second pause, the kind that wouldn't register to anyone who wasn't watching for it. Iron Bear was watching for it. From probate, Daniel said, and from federal estate taxes if the property value triggers the threshold. The threshold for federal estate tax, Margaret said, is currently $12 million. Silence. My house, she continued, is worth $430,000. Daniel started to say something. I looked it up, Margaret said. 2 weeks ago, the night I stopped sleeping well. She looked at him across the table with the same clear eyes she'd used to walk across the diner towards 6 men who frightened everyone else. I've had a lot of time to look things up, Daniel. The shift in the room was physical. Iron Bear felt it. Not from Margaret, she was still composed, her hands folded on the table exactly the way they'd been since she sat down. From Daniel, something in the set of his shoulders changed by a fraction, and that fraction was everything because it meant the recalibration was happening again. A deeper one this time, a man who had arrived with a plan and was now computing how many of its components were still intact. Quite a few, his expression said. Not all, but enough. You've been doing research, Daniel said. That's good, that's smart. He nodded as if she had passed a small test. But there are other considerations. Show me the medical evaluation, Iron Bear said. Dead stop. Daniel turned to look at him. The smile was still there, but it had gone thin at the edges. I'm sorry. The medical evaluation, the one that was filed with the power of attorney, show it to me. That's a private medical document. She's sitting right here, Iron Bear said. If it's her document, she can authorize you to show it. Miss Margaret, do you authorize him to show it? I do, Margaret said immediately. Daniel looked at the folder, back at Iron Bear. I don't have it with me. You're a lawyer, Hammer said from the booth behind him. He said it the way you say something that's already a verdict. Daniel turned registered Hammer for the first time as something other than furniture and turned back. I don't carry medical documents to a casual breakfast meeting, Daniel said, and something in his voice had sharpened. The patience was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched over something harder. Then let's call the doctor, Iron Bear said. Excuse me? The doctor whose name is on the evaluation. Let's call his office right now. Miss Margaret can ask them when she was seen and what they found. He took out his phone and set it on the table face up. You got the doctor's name handy, I can look up the number. Daniel Pierce looked at the phone on the table. He looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, and then he closed the leather folder. I think, he said slowly, we've gotten off track. This doesn't need to be confrontational. He looked at Margaret with an expression of wounded patience. I came here because I care about you. Your children are busy. Ellen is in Chattanooga. Robert Jr. is in Phoenix. They have their own lives. I'm the one who's been here, Aunt Margaret. I'm the one who made time. Margaret looked at him. You're right, she said. You have made time. A pause, quiet and precise. I've been trying to understand why. Daniel spread his hands. Because you're family. You came to my house 4 times in the last 3 months, Margaret said. Before that, I hadn't seen you since Carol's funeral. 12 years. She looked at him steadily. People don't change like that, Daniel. Not without a reason. People grow, Daniel said. People realize what matters. What did the Knoxville developer offer you? Iron Bear asked. The question was a rock thrown through glass. Daniel turned to him fast, faster than he'd moved since he sat down. I don't know what you're talking about. The developer, Iron Bear said, the one who wants to put a subdivision on the 6 acres on Sycamore Road. What's your cut? Daniel's jaw tightened. The smile was gone now, not gone replaced with something else, just gone. Who told you? He stopped himself, caught himself mid-sentence and stopped, rerouted, breathed. There is no developer, he said. Okay, Iron Bear said. There is no developer, Daniel said again with more weight. Okay, Iron Bear said. The repetition was deliberate, and Daniel knew it, and they both knew the other one knew it, and the table knew it, and the diner knew it, and the silence that followed was not the silence of an argument paused, but the silence of a lie sitting in the open where everyone could see it. Vera at the counter had her phone in her hand. The turn came from somewhere none of them expected. Torch, the youngest, the one with the red beard, who had been quiet since Daniel walked in, leaned forward from his counter stool and said, My grandmother lost her house. Nobody moved. She didn't even know she'd lost it until she went to pay her property tax, Torch said. He wasn't talking to Daniel. He wasn't performing anything. He was just talking. Guy convinced her to sign something, said it was an insurance update. She was 77 and she'd been alone for 5 years. She trusted people. She signed it. He picked up his coffee cup. She was out of that house in 4 months. Spent her last 3 years in a county facility, 40 minutes from anyone she'd ever known. He looked at Daniel. The man who did it wore a nice suit too. Daniel said nothing. That was your family? Margaret asked quietly. My grandmother, Torch said. Mary Adkins. She deserved better. Something shifted in Margaret's face. Not grief. Something closer to recognition, the particular understanding of one person who has felt a thing when they meet another person who has felt the same thing. She looked at Torch, this young man with his red beard and his road-worn leather, and she said, I'm sorry about Mary. I know, Torch said. And she'd have liked you when Daniel Pierce, who had walked into the Rusty Spoon Diner 40 minutes ago, with a clean legal structure and a trustworthy pen, was now sitting at a table in a small-town Tennessee diner at 9 in the morning, being looked at by a 26-year-old and an 89-year-old and a man named Iron Bear, and the clean legal structure was starting to feel like it had been built on sand. But he was not done. That was the thing about men like Daniel Pierce. They were not done until they actually couldn't move anymore. Here's what I think, Daniel said, and his voice had changed again. Gone quiet, gone careful, the kind of quiet that isn't calm but is controlled. I think my aunt has been having conversations with people who don't have all the information. I think she's been frightened unnecessarily by incomplete pictures of a situation that is actually very straightforward. He looked at Iron Bear directly. And I think you, whoever you are, have inserted yourself into a family matter that has legal standing behind it, and that the documents in this folder are valid and enforceable and signed. She wants them reviewed, Iron Bear said. They've already been signed by a woman who was told they were insurance updates. Iron Bear kept his voice level. By a woman who was never evaluated by the doctor whose name is on the medical form. By a woman who signed a power of attorney because someone she trusted sat in her living room and talked about her dead sister until she felt safe. He looked at Daniel without blinking. A lawyer would know what that's called. What's called, Daniel said. His voice had gone very careful. Undue influence, said a voice from the counter. Preacher, from under his cap. He hadn't moved from his stool. He said the two words and then went back to his coffee like he'd said nothing more significant than the weather. Daniel turned to look at him. He's right, isn't he? Iron Bear said. That's the legal term, undue influence. It can void a contract. It can void a power of attorney. He paused. A lawyer would know that. The silence was different now. It had edges, yet. What happened next, what turned the whole axis of the morning, came from behind the counter. Vera set down her phone. She picked up her order pad. She walked to the table. She did not look at Daniel. She looked at Iron Bear. There's something I didn't say earlier, she said. I thought about it. I've been thinking about it for 6 weeks. I didn't say anything because she stopped, started again. I was scared, not of him, of what happens after, to my ma, to whether anyone would believe me. Vera, Margaret said carefully. 2 months ago, Vera said, a man came in, not him. She didn't look at Daniel. A different man. Older, maybe mid-60s, drove a white sedan. He asked about Margaret, said he was doing a family wellness check, asked if she seemed he used the word lucid, whether she seemed lucid, whether she came in alone, whether she remembered the same things week to week. Nobody spoke. I told him she was fine, because she is fine. Vera's voice stayed steady. But the next week I started paying attention. And 4 weeks ago, Margaret came in and she left her glasses on the table. I picked them up and I was going to call her, and I noticed there was a piece of paper folded inside the glasses case. She looked at Margaret. I didn't read it. I called you. I came back for them, Margaret said softly. I told you I must have left them. You did tell me that. Vera looked at the table. But you looked at me for a second before you said it. And the look you had, she shook her head. I should have asked then. I didn't ask. I'm asking now. The whole diner was listening. Nobody was pretending to eat. The man in the John Deere cap had turned fully around. The young mother had stopped trying to keep her son from paying attention. Margaret reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She unfolded a small piece of paper, creased and soft from being folded and unfolded many times, and she set it on the table. It was a name and a phone number. Margaret looked at it. Attorney Sarah Henley, she said. Someone left it in my mailbox. No note, just his card. She looked up. I thought about throwing it away. I thought it was an advertisement. She paused. But the glasses case, she looked at Vera. I didn't leave my glasses. I put this in the glasses case on purpose because I was afraid Daniel might search my purse. I knew you'd hold them for me if I pretended to leave them. Vera blinked. You used me. I trusted you, Margaret said. It's the same thing when it matters. Something moved across Vera's face. It was not a simple thing, and it didn't last long, but it was real. The attorney, Iron Bear said. Sarah Henley, did you call her? 3 weeks ago, Margaret said. She's the one who told me about the medical evaluation. She's the one who told me what the power of attorney actually said. She looked at Daniel. She said whoever left her card in my mailbox probably saved my house. Everyone at the table looked at Daniel. Daniel said nothing. Who left the card? Daniel, Iron Bear asked. I have no idea what you're talking about, Daniel said. Someone in your circle had a conscience, Preacher said from the counter, still not looking up from his coffee. That's interesting. Daniel started to respond, stopped. He looked at the folder in front of him. He looked at Margaret. He looked at Iron Bear. He looked at the diner full of people watching him. He looked at the phone on the table. This is not what it looks like, he said. What does it look like? Iron Bear asked. Daniel didn't answer. Because from here, Iron Bear said, It looks like a man who built a legal structure on top of a fraudulent medical document, who cultivated a relationship with an elderly woman who had recently lost her son, who manufactured authority over her financial affairs, and who drove here this morning to finish the job before anyone could stop him. He paused. Is that what it looks like to you? The silence lasted 5 full seconds. Daniel picked up his pen, set it down, picked up the leather folder. I'm going to step outside, he said, and make a phone call. And when I come back, we're going to have a different conversation. Okay, Iron Bear said, but leave the folder. Daniel looked at him. Leave the folder, Iron Bear said again. Miss Margaret's documents, don't leave this table without her say-so. For a moment, a genuine, taut, dangerous moment, it seemed like Daniel Pierce might actually push it. He was not a physical man, not in any direct sense, but he was a man who had spent his adult life being the person who decided how things ended, and being told to leave something on a table by a biker in a Tennessee diner was a category of experience he had not previously encountered. He left the folder. He walked out. The door of the Rusty Spoon swung shut behind him. Margaret exhaled, not the way she'd exhaled before when Daniel first walked in. This one was different. This one had something close to disbelief in it. He'll come back, she said. I know, Iron Bear said. He'll come back with a better approach. He always finds a better approach. Let him find it, Iron Bear said. We'll be here. Hammer leaned over the back of the booth. You got a phone number for that attorney, Henley? Yes. Call her, Hammer said. Right now. Tell her where you are and what's happening. She needs to know the documents are in hand. Margaret looked at Iron Bear. Iron Bear nodded. She took out her phone. Her fingers moved on it slowly with the deliberateness of someone for whom touchscreens were a second language. And then she held it to her ear and waited. The diner was very still. Sarah, Margaret said. It's Margaret Whitmore. I'm at the Rusty Spoon. He's here. I have the documents. A pause. Yes, I'm not alone. Another pause. Her eyes moved to Iron Bear and she almost smiled. I'm very not alone. Another pause longer. How soon? Listen. She listened. All right, we'll be here. She lowered the phone. She's been waiting for this call, Margaret said. She's 20 minutes away. Stone said from across the table the second thing he'd said all morning. Then we wait 20 minutes. Big Mac stood up from the big table and walked over to the counter and sat down next to Preacher. He looked at Vera. You got pie? He asked. We have pie, Vera said. What kind? Apple and chess. One of each, Big Mac said. And top off this coffee if you would. Vera looked at him. He looked back. And something about the absolute ordinariness of a man ordering pie in the middle of an extraordinary morning made Vera laugh short and surprised and real, and the sound of it broke something in the room. The man in the John Deere cap turned back to his eggs. The young mother let her son have his phone back. Gerald in the kitchen started making noise again. The diner breathed. Margaret sat with her hands around her coffee cup, the folder on the table in front of her, and beside her, the man she had walked toward when everyone else looked away. Rex, she said quietly. Yeah. Whatever happens when he comes back. He's not walking out of here with those documents, Iron Bear said. Not loudly, not as a threat, just as a fact the way you state the temperature or the time. Margaret looked at the folder. He'll say the signing was valid. He'll say I was competent. He's going to say a lot of things, Iron Bear said, and then Sarah Henley is going to walk through that door. Margaret looked at him. And then Iron Bear said, things are going to get very different for Daniel Pierce. Outside through the window, Daniel was standing in the parking lot with his phone pressed to his ear. His posture had changed. The good suit still fit perfectly, but something in the way he was standing, slightly forward, slightly tight, said that the conversation he was having was not the one he'd planned on having this morning. Torch watched him through the window. He's calling someone, Torch said. His attorney, Preacher said. You think, that's what I'd do, Preacher said. He sipped his coffee. When everything you plan stops working, you call the person you pay to fix it. Will it work? Torch asked. Preacher looked at him. Sarah Henley is 20 minutes away and we're sitting on the documents. He shrugged a small, economical movement. He needed to finish this before anyone could stop him. Anyone already stopped him. Torch looked at Margaret. You did that, he said. You walked over to us. Margaret looked at him. You're the one who stopped him, Torch said. We're just here. Margaret looked at this young man with his red beard and his grandmother's memory behind his eyes. You're not just here, she said. You're exactly here. There's a difference. Outside, Daniel Pierce ended his call. He stood in the parking lot for a moment. He looked at the diner door. He looked at the folder visible through the window still on the table. He reached for the door handle. And inside, the rusty spoon iron bear straightened slightly in his seat, and Margaret Whitmore looked at the door, and this time, for the first time in 6 months, she was not afraid of what was coming through it. Daniel Pierce came back through the door like a man who had used his 10 minutes outside to rebuild himself from the studs up. The posture was straighter, the face was reset. Whatever conversation he'd had in the parking lot had given him something, not confidence, exactly, but the performance of it, which in Daniel's world had always been close enough to the real thing to get the job done. He walked back to the booth without hurrying. He pulled the chair out. He sat down. He looked at the leather folder on the table in front of Margaret, and then he looked at Iron Bear, and he said calmly and without preamble, I've spoken with my attorney. Good, Iron Bear said. He's confirmed that everything in that folder is legally sound. The power of attorney was executed properly. The medical evaluation was filed with the court. The transfer documents are ready for signature. Daniel folded his hands on the table. He also reminded me that interfering with a legally executed document process can itself carry liability. He let that land. Iron Bear picked up his coffee cup, drank, set it down. That's interesting, he said. Tell me something. Your attorney, did he know about the doctor? What about the doctor, whether he actually saw Miss Margaret? Iron Bear looked at him evenly. Because that's the piece, that's the whole thing. Everything in that folder runs through a medical evaluation that declares her cognitively impaired. And the doctor who signed that evaluation has no record of ever meeting her. He paused. Did you tell your attorney that part? The fraction of a second that passed before Daniel answered was not long, but it existed. The evaluation was conducted properly, Daniel said. Then call him, Margaret said. Daniel looked at her. Call the doctor, Margaret said. Right now, from this table. Ask him to confirm the date he evaluated me and what he found. I'm not going to. Why not? Iron Bear asked. Because this isn't a courtroom. No, Iron Bear said. It's a diner with witnesses, which is actually worse for you. Hammer from the booth behind let out a low sound that was not quite a laugh. Daniel didn't turn around. He was getting better at not turning around. He was getting better in real time at managing a situation that was no longer the one he'd prepared for. But he was managing it. That was the thing that Margaret felt in her chest like a cold hand. Daniel Pierce was losing ground, and he was still managing. It's still finding handholds, still looking for the angle. She'd watched him do this for 6 months. She knew how long he could sustain it. She just needed Sarah Henley to get here in the next 14 minutes. Aunt Margaret, Daniel said, and his voice had gone soft again, gone careful, gone to the place that it went when he was recalibrating toward personal rather than legal. I know this looks wrong to you. I know you've been talking to people who've told you things that frightened you, but I need you to hear me. He leaned forward slightly. Robert Jr. called me. Did you know that 2 months ago? He called me and he told me he was worried about you living alone. He asked if there was any way I could look in on things. Margaret went very still. Robert Jr., she said. He's concerned, Daniel said. Ellen is concerned. They're just far away. They have families of their own. They asked me to help because I'm closer. He opened his hands. That's all this is. Family taking care of family. Robert Jr. asked you to pursue a property transfer, Iron Bear said. Robert Jr. asked me to make sure his mother was protected, Daniel said. The how, that was my judgment. Does he know about the transfer documents? He knows I'm looking out for her interests. Does he know about the transfer documents? Iron Bear said one word at a time. Daniel said nothing. Because if he knew, Iron Bear said, and he approved of a plan to move his mother's house into a trust you control, he'd be here. He wouldn't send you. He'd be sitting right where you're sitting, looking his mother in the eye. He looked at Daniel steadily. Is Robert Jr. here? The silence was its own answer. Margaret looked at the tabletop. Her jaw was tight. She had not known about Robert Jr.'s call. She had not known that either. She filed it somewhere cold and quiet in the back of her mind, And she kept her face still because she had been keeping her face still for 6 months, and she was very good at it now. My son, she said quietly, didn't know what he was starting. He was worried about you, Daniel said, and there was something almost genuine in it which made it worse. He was worried about me, Margaret said, and you turned his worry into a key. She looked at Daniel. That's who you are, Daniel. You find what people love and you turn it into a door. The table absorbed that. Even Daniel absorbed it. For just a moment, something moved behind his face that wasn't legal strategy and wasn't performance. It was gone fast, but it was there. Torch saw it from the counter. He filed it away. 9 minutes to Sarah Henley. Iron Bear knew this because he'd looked at the clock on the wall when Margaret hung up the phone, and he'd been counting since. He didn't look at the clock again. He didn't need to. He just needed Daniel Pierce to keep talking. Let's talk about the medical evaluation, Iron Bear said. We've been through. Humor me, Iron Bear said, because here's what I don't understand. You're a lawyer. You know what undue influence is. You know what elder financial abuse statutes look like. You know that a fraudulent medical evaluation in a power of attorney proceeding is not a misdemeanor. He paused. So what I can't figure out is whether you thought no one would ever check or whether you had someone who could cover it if they did. Daniel's eyes narrowed, just slightly, just enough. I'm going to say something, Daniel said, and I want you to hear it clearly. I came here today to help my aunt. Everything I've done has been with her well-being as the goal. Whatever conclusions you have drawn them without understanding the full picture. And when this is resolved legally through proper channels, that will become clear. The full picture, Iron Bear said. Yes. What's in the full picture that we're missing? That's not something I'm going to discuss here. See, that's interesting, Preacher said from the counter. He still hadn't moved. He was still looking at his coffee. When a man says the full picture clears him, but he won't say what's in it, that tells you something about the picture. Daniel turned to look at him properly for the first time. Preacher did not look back. Who are you people? Daniel said. Not angry, genuinely asking, which was somehow more unsettling than anger. We're having breakfast, Big Mac said from the other end of the counter, around a fork full of chess pie. You rode in from where? That's not relevant, Iron Bear said. It's relevant to me, Daniel said, because I have a legal folder and proper documentation and a family relationship, and you have, he gestured a small, controlled gesture around the table. Breakfast. And witnesses, Iron Bear said. And an attorney on the way, Hammer added from behind. Daniel looked at Iron Bear. An attorney. 20 minutes away when Miss Margaret called, Iron Bear said. That was 11 minutes ago. The calculation happened behind Daniel's eyes in real time. Iron Bear watched it happen. Watched the man add up what 9 more minutes meant and what it didn't mean and what his options looked like on either side of it. Daniel reached for the leather folder. I'll leave the documents for her to review, he said. We can reschedule. The documents stay, Iron Bear said. They're mine. They have her name and her signature on them, Iron Bear said. They stay on this table until her attorney looks at them. Daniel's hand was on the folder. Iron Bear's hand came down on off of the folder. Not grabbing, not snatching, just there. Flat, unmovable as a stone in a road. The diner went to a different kind of still. Daniel looked at the hand on the folder, at the tattoos on the arm, at the man the arm was attached to. You're making a mistake, Daniel said very quietly. That's possible, Iron Bear said. Leave the documents. 3 seconds. 5. Daniel released the folder. He sat back. He looked at Margaret. This isn't over, he said, not a threat, almost a statement of grief, which was the strangest thing about it. I know, Margaret said, but it's different now. You came in here this morning to finish something, and it isn't finished. And the reason it isn't finished is sitting next to me. She looked at him calmly. You spent 6 months making me feel alone, Daniel. That was your strategy. Isolated people sign things. Isolated people don't fight back. She looked at the table of 6 men who had eaten breakfast in a Tennessee diner and become something else between the first cup of coffee and the second. I'm not isolated anymore. The door of the Rusty Spoon opened. Not Daniel leaving. Someone coming in. Sarah Henley was 38 years old, small and quick-moving, with dark hair pulled back and a canvas bag over one shoulder that she swung onto the nearest table as she came through the door and scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had walked into difficult rooms before and knew how to read them fast. She found Margaret. She found the leather folder. She found Iron Bear. She found Daniel. She pulled up a chair. "Margaret," she said, "I'm sorry it took this long." She looked at the folder. "Is that it?" "That's it," Margaret said. Sarah reached for the folder. Daniel put his hand on it. "These are my documents," he said. "They have your client's signature," Sarah said. She looked at him with professional neutrality, the kind of neutral that isn't friendly. "I'm her attorney. I have the right to review anything bearing her signature. Please take your hand off the folder." 4 seconds. Daniel took his hand off the folder. Sarah opened it. What followed was the quietest 15 minutes Iron Bear had ever sat through. Sarah read. She did not rush. She turned pages the way attorneys turn pages, not reading every word in order, but moving through it with a specific search pattern, looking for the load-bearing pieces, the joints where the structure was held together or could be taken apart. Margaret sat beside Iron Bear and watched her. Daniel sat at the end of the table and watched her. Iron Bear sat and let the room do what it was doing. At the third page, Sarah paused. She went back to the first page. She looked at something. She went to the third page again. "Who is Dr. Franklin Marsh?" she asked without looking up. "The evaluating physician," Daniel said. "Has he ever met my client?" "He conducted the evaluation." "Has he ever met my client?" Sarah said again, the same words, the same tone, no variation. Daniel said nothing. Sarah looked up from the folder. She looked at Daniel with the kind of look that strips the professional neutrality away and just says plainly what it sees. "The signature on this evaluation," she said, "matches Franklin Marsh's signature on file in 2 other documents I've seen in elder financial abuse cases in this state." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "He's a real doctor. He has a real license. He also has a pattern of signing evaluations for individuals he has never personally examined in exchange for a fee that never appears in his billing records." She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the table. "The document," Sarah said, "is fraudulent. The power of attorney that rests on it is therefore voidable. The transfer documents are void." She closed the folder. "And the question of whether this constitutes elder financial abuse under Tennessee Code Annotated Section 71-6-117 is something the district attorney's office is going to find very interesting." The diner had stopped breathing again. "I haven't done anything," Daniel started. "You constructed a fraudulent medical record, used it to establish unauthorized legal authority over a vulnerable adult, and arrived today to complete an asset transfer that would have netted you approximately $400,000 of property that was not yours." Sarah's voice was flat and exact, the voice of someone reading from a document they have already written in their head. "That's not nothing, Mr. Pierce." Daniel stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Margaret. And something happened in his face that was more complicated than anything that had happened in his face all morning. It wasn't remorse, not exactly. It wasn't anger. It was the expression of a man who had walked a long way down a road and only now standing at the end of it was beginning to understand where the road had actually gone. "I told myself it was for your benefit," he said. His voice had lost its architecture. It was just a voice now. "I want you to know that. I told myself you couldn't manage it, that you'd lose it anyway, that I was just getting ahead of something inevitable." Margaret looked at him. "I know," she said. "I told myself." "Daniel," she said gently but without warmth, "the worst things people do to each other are always the things they've told themselves a good story about first." She looked at him steadily. "That's not a defense. That's a confession." Daniel Pierce picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on it, and he looked back at the room, at Sarah with the folder, at Iron Bear, at the diner full of people who had watched the whole morning happen, and then he walked out. The door closed behind him. The parking lot received him. And the Rusty Spoon Diner sat in the quiet of something that had just been prevented from happening, which is its own particular kind of quiet, not triumphant, not relieved yet, just still. The way a room feels when something heavy has been set down. Sarah turned to Margaret. "How are you?" she asked. "Not legally, just actually." Margaret thought about it. "I've been better," she said, "but I haven't been safer. Not in 6 months." Sarah looked at Iron Bear. "And you are Rex," Iron Bear said. "Are you family?" Iron Bear looked at Margaret. "Yes," Margaret said before he could answer. "He is." Sarah accepted this without question. which was its own kind of professionalism. She pulled a legal pad from her canvas bag and uncapped a pen and started making notes. "I'm going to need a statement from everyone who was present," she said. "Everything you saw and heard from the moment Daniel Pierce entered the diner. All of it matters." She looked around the table. "Is everyone willing?" "Yes," said Hammer from behind. "Yep," said Torch from the counter. "Fine by me," said Big Mac, cutting another piece of chess pie. Stone said nothing, but he nodded, once, which from Stone was a speech. Preacher finally looked up from his coffee. "Every word of it," he said. Sarah started writing. Vera brought more coffee without being asked. She went around the whole table filling cups, and when she got to Margaret, she set the pot down and put her hand on Margaret's shoulder for just a moment. Not a dramatic thing, not a speech, just a hand on a shoulder, the way you tell someone you see them when words are not the right tool. Margaret put her hand over Vera's hand. They stayed like that for exactly 3 seconds. Then Vera picked up the pot and went back to the counter because there were other people in the diner, and they needed coffee too. And that was her job. And she was good at it, and being good at your job is its own kind of dignity. It was Iron Bear who asked the question that had been sitting at the edge of the table since Sarah walked in. What happens now to him? Sarah kept writing. If the DA's office takes it, and I think they will, because Dr. Marsh is not a new name to them, Daniel Pierce is looking at felony charges. Elder financial abuse fraud, document falsification. She turned a page on her legal pad. He'll lose his law license. That's nearly certain regardless of how the criminal case resolves. And Miss Margaret's house? Secure, Sarah said. The documents are void. I'll file a motion to invalidate the power of attorney by end of day. We'll have a court order by Thursday at the latest. Iron Bear nodded. He looked at Margaret. Margaret was looking at her hands on the table. She was not crying. She was the kind of person who didn't cry in front of people she'd only known for 2 hours regardless of what those 2 hours had contained. But her hands, which had been folded and still and composed all morning, had loosened slightly, and the loosening was its own kind of expression. The body doing what the face wouldn't, letting go of something it had been gripping for a very long time. Your son, Iron Bear said. Robert Jr. Are you going to call him? Yes, Margaret said. He didn't understand what he'd done. It doesn't excuse it, but... She stopped. He was trying to help me. Daniel found that, turned it into something else. She exhaled slowly. He's going to be devastated when he finds out. He should be, Hammer said from behind. Hammer, Iron Bear said. I'm just saying. She knows, Iron Bear said. She doesn't need you to say it. A pause. Fair enough. Margaret looked back at Iron Bear. Do you have a way to reach your son? Iron Bear was quiet for a moment. I have a number. Does he answer when you call? He used to not, Iron Bear said. I haven't tried in a while. Try, Margaret said simply. Without pressure, without weight, just the word itself offered the way she'd offered the question that started all of this with the particular courage of someone who has run out of reasons to be careful. Iron Bear looked at the table. He looked at the phone he'd laid flat on the table over an hour ago and not picked up since. He didn't say anything, but he picked up the phone and he held it. That was something. Sarah finished her preliminary notes and looked at the room. I need about 20 minutes with Margaret alone, she said. If that's all right, you it to everyone. Iron Bear stood. The others redistributed without being asked. Hammer and Stone to the counter. Torch and Preacher to the big table in the middle, Big Mac staying where he was because he'd ordered a second piece of pie and he was going to finish it. Iron Bear moved to the counter and sat down 2 stools from Vera. She set a fresh cup in front of him without asking. You do this a lot? Vera asked. Eat breakfast. Show up when things need, she thought about the right word, ballast. Iron Bear wrapped his hands around the cup. No, he said. We were passing through. We needed coffee. And then she walked across the room. And then she walked across the room. Vera leaned against the counter. What made you say yes? You could have said no. Most people would have. Iron Bear thought about that. He thought about his mother, who he'd carried for years in the hollow place, where grief lives when it's too old to be called grief anymore, and too present to be called memory. He thought about the last time he'd sat in a hospital room with someone small and certain, and in the process of being taken apart by something she didn't deserve. He thought about what he should have done then and what he'd done instead, and the gap between those two things that he'd spent a long time trying not to measure. She didn't look scared, he said finally. She looked like someone who'd decided. Decided what? That she'd rather walk toward the thing than keep waiting for it to reach her. He looked at his coffee. I respect that more than almost anything. Vera looked at him for a moment. She asked you to be her son, she said. Yeah. And Iron Bear looked over at the booth where Margaret sat with Sarah Henley upright and attentive, answering questions in her clear, careful way. The blue cardigan still buttoned, the pearl buttons, still even the silver hair, still perfect, still the woman who set her hair with rollers every Sunday night the way her mother taught her when Eisenhower was president. She didn't need a son, Iron Bear said. She needed someone who wouldn't flinch. He picked up his coffee. She got 6. Vera looked at the booth, looked back at him. You know what I think, she said. Tell me. I think she needed both, Vera said, and she knew it. That's why she asked the way she asked. Iron Bear didn't respond to that, but he held on to it. The booth across the diner, Margaret was telling Sarah something. Something that made Sarah stop writing and look at her. Something that made Sarah set the pen down entirely. Iron Bear watched. He couldn't hear it. But Margaret's face, as she said whatever she was saying, was the face of someone releasing something they'd been carrying alone for a very long time. And the releasing of it, even from 40 feet away, even through the ordinary noise of a diner on a Tuesday morning, was something worth watching. Torch slid onto the stool next to Iron Bear. She's going to be okay, Torch said. He said it like he was confirming something he needed to confirm. Yeah, Iron Bear said. After this, she's going to be okay. She was going to be okay regardless, Iron Bear said. She walked across a room full of strangers to ask for help. People who do that, he shook his head. They don't fold. Torch was quiet for a moment. I keep thinking about my grandmother, he said. Iron Bear nodded. She never asked for help, Torch said. She never, he stopped. She was too proud, or too scared, or both. She didn't want to be a burden. He picked up his coffee cup. And the man who took her house knew that. He knew she wouldn't ask. Daniel knew the same thing about Margaret, Iron Bear said. Or he thought he did. She proved him wrong. She proved him completely wrong, Iron Bear said. They sat for a moment in the particular companionship of men who are not given to long speeches, which is its own valid kind of closeness. Then Sarah Henley appeared at Margaret's booth entrance and looked across the diner at Iron Bear. She raised a hand. Come here. Iron Bear set down his cup and walked over. He slid into the booth across from the two women. Sarah looked at him with the direct, measuring look of a professional who has decided someone has earned information they're about to be given. Margaret has told me something, Sarah said. Something beyond the documents. Iron Bear waited. There's a second property, Sarah said. A rental house 2 miles from here. Margaret owns it. It generates $1,100 a month in income. She's been depositing that income into the same account for 20 years. She looked at Margaret. 3 months ago, Daniel set up a redirect on the account. The last 2 months of rent payments went into an account in his name. Iron Bear looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at him with the calm of someone delivering news they've already made peace with being devastated by. He was already taking money, she said. Before the house, he was already doing it. That changes the charge category, Sarah said quietly. That's not attempted elder financial abuse. That's active, ongoing financial exploitation. She folded her hands on the legal pad. That's a different level of criminal exposure for him entirely. Iron Bear looked at the door of the diner. Through the window, the parking lot was empty. Daniel Pierce was long gone. He doesn't know you know, Iron Bear said. No, Sarah said. He thought the redirect was too small to notice. He underestimated her again, Iron Bear said. He underestimated her every single time, Sarah said. That was his only real mistake. Margaret looked at Iron Bear. What happens now, she asked. Iron Bear looked at the empty parking lot. At the door Daniel Pierce had walked out of. At the folder sitting closed on the table in Sarah Henley's capable hands. Then he looked at Margaret Whitmore, this 89-year-old woman who had walked across a diner toward the thing everyone else ran from, who had hidden a card in a glasses case and called an attorney in secret and held herself straight for 6 months under the weight of something that should have broken her, and he said the only true thing there was left to say. Now he said, we make sure he can't do it to anyone else. Sarah Henley made 3 phone calls from the corner of the Rusty Spoon Diner, and each one landed harder than the last. The first was to the Tennessee Adult Protective Services hotline, which she had on speed dial the way other people have their dentist, because in her line of work, the number came up that often. She gave them Daniel Pierce's name, Margaret's name, the address on Sycamore Road, and the account redirect. She gave them Dr. Franklin Marsh's name and the case number from the evaluation filing. She spoke for 4 minutes in the clipped, precise language of someone who has learned that emotion slows these calls down and facts speed them up. When she hung up, she said without turning around, "They're opening a case today. Not next week, today." The second call was to the district attorney's office in Knoxville, where she apparently knew someone personally because she said his first name when he picked up and then said, "I've got Marsh again." And the conversation that followed was short, and the person on the other end did most of the talking. When she hung up from that one, she was quiet for a moment before she turned back to the room. "They've been building a file on Franklin Marsh for 14 months, she said. "Margaret is the fourth victim they can document. She's also," Sarah paused, "she's the first one who still has the asset. The first three already lost what he helped take." The diner absorbed that. "So she's the one who can actually testify to the attempt," Iron Bear said. "And to the completed theft," Sarah said. "The rental income redirect is documented. 2 months of payments. That's evidence of an active scheme, not just an attempt." She sat back down. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "I've been honest with you about everything," Margaret said. "I know, but this is different." Sarah looked at her directly. "The man who left your attorney's card in the mailbox. You told me you don't know who it was." "I don't," Margaret said, "but you have a theory." A pause. Margaret looked at her hands. "Daniel had a paralegal, a young woman. She was with him twice when he came to my house." She took notes. Very quiet, very professional. "The second time she came, when Daniel was in the bathroom, she looked at me very quickly and she said," Margaret stopped. "She said you should have a lawyer of your own, Mrs. Whitmore. Someone you picked yourself." That was all she said. Daniel came back and she went back to her notes. Sarah wrote something down. "Her name?" Sarah asked. "He called her Claire," Margaret said. "I don't know her last name." "I'll find her," Sarah said. Iron Bear looked at Margaret. She took a real risk. "She did," Margaret said. "A young woman in a law office working for the man who signs her checks." She shook her head. She knew what he was doing. She couldn't stop it from inside. So she handed me a thread. "And you pulled it," Torch said from across the room. Margaret looked at him. "I pulled it," she said. The call Margaret had been avoiding came 40 minutes after Daniel left. Her phone lit up on the table. Ellen, her daughter, her oldest child. She looked at it for 2 rings. Iron Bear noticed. "You don't have to answer right now." "She'll worry if I don't," Margaret said, and she picked up. "Mom." Ellen's voice came through immediately, taut and ready, the voice of someone who has been sitting on the edge of something for hours. "Mom, I just got a call from Robert Jr. He said you were upset with him." "What's happening?" "He said something about Daniel in a meeting, and I couldn't get the whole story because he was barely making sense." "Ellen," Margaret said, "I'm all right. I need you to listen to me for a moment." "What's going on?" "Where are you?" "I'm at the Rusty Spoon. I'm safe. I have an attorney with me, and..." She glanced at Iron Bear. "Friends." "What attorney, Mom? What?" "Daniel was attempting to take the house," Margaret said. She said it cleanly without preamble because she had learned in 89 years that certain truths do not get easier with preparation. "He built a legal structure using a fraudulent medical evaluation and a power of attorney I signed without fully understanding what it said. He was here this morning to complete an asset transfer. He's gone now. The documents are with my attorney. The house is safe." Silence on the line. "Then I'm going to be sick." "Don't be sick," Margaret said. "Arsamae." "Be angry. Anger is more useful." "Mom." "And then after you're angry, call Robert Jr. and tell him this is not his fault. He didn't know. Daniel is very good at finding what people love and using it." Her voice was still steady, still composed. From a distance, it might have sounded like a woman describing a weather event, something that had passed over and left the ground wet, but not broken. "Robert Jr. called Daniel because he loves me, and he was worried. That's a good thing that was turned into a bad thing. Make sure he knows the difference." "When did you..." "How long have you known?" "Long enough," Margaret said. "Why didn't you call me?" The question had a particular weight to it. Not accusation, something more painful than accusation, the weight of a child who realizes they were protected from something their parent carried alone. Because you would have cried, Margaret said simply, and I needed my hands free. Silence. Then Ellen said, I'm coming. I'm getting in the car right now. You don't have to. Mom, I'm getting in the car. Margaret looked at the table, at Sarah's legal pad, at Iron Bear's coffee cup next to hers, at the leather folder closed and inert, now diffused. All right, she said, drive carefully. She hung up. The diner was quiet for a moment. She's coming, Vera said from the counter. Not a question. She's coming, Margaret said. Good, Vera said, and the word carried everything she didn't say after it. Bah. It was Big Mac who first said what everyone else had been thinking since Sarah made her second call. He finished his second piece of pizza, set the fork down, pushed the plate to the edge of the counter for Vera and said, he's going to run. Iron Bear looked at him. Pierce, Big Mac said, he's smart. He knows the documents are compromised. He knows she has an attorney who knows about Marsh. He knows the DA has his name now. He folded his arms. He's going to clear out and put distance between himself and this before the day's out. Sarah looked up from her legal pad. He has a practice in Nashville. Clients, a lease. He can't just... He absolutely can, Big Mac said. Men like him always have an exit ready. They don't build the kind of schemes he built without knowing exactly how fast they can become someone else somewhere else. He looked at Iron Bear. We've seen it. Once or twice, Iron Bear said. Sarah's pen stopped moving. Are you saying he'll flee? I'm saying someone should make sure the DA's office knows that's a possibility, Big Mac said. Today, not Thursday, today. Sarah was already reaching for her phone. Hammer from the end of the counter said quietly, there's something else we should be doing. The question was directed at Iron Bear. It was the question that lived underneath all the others, the one that existed in the gap between what the law could do in the next 6 hours and what could be done by 6 men who had no legal authority, but a very clear sense of what was right. Iron Bear looked at the counter. He looked at Margaret. He made a decision in the space of 2 seconds, which was how he made most decisions, not quickly out of impulse, but quickly, because the deliberation had already happened somewhere underneath the surface in the part of him that had been paying attention before he knew he was paying attention. No, he said, we stay right here. We give our statements. We let Sarah do her job. We let the law do its job. And if the law doesn't move fast enough, Torch asked, then we come back to that question, Iron Bear said. But we're not there yet. He looked at Hammer. We're not there yet. Hammer held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once. The diner settled back into itself. But something had changed in the air of it, a heightened quality, a charge, the particular tension of a situation that is not finished, and that everyone in the room knows is not finished. Daniel Pierce had walked out the door, but his absence was not peace. His absence was a held breath. Robert Jr. called Margaret back at 11:17. She answered immediately. The conversation lasted 9 minutes, and Iron Bear, sitting close enough to hear her side of it, could piece together the other side from what she said, and when she said it, and how her face moved through it. Robert Jr. wept. That was clear from the first 30 seconds. He wept the way men weep when they understand they've been used, not gently, not quietly, but with the full-body devastation of someone whose love was turned into a tool by someone who knew exactly what they were reaching for. Margaret let him cry for a little while. Then she said, Robert, listen to me. I need you to stop. A pause. I know, she said. I know, but listen, none of what he did was possible because you love me. It was possible because he found out you loved me and used it. That's the difference. That's the whole difference. Pause. No, she said. You could not have known. He's a lawyer. He spent years doing this. You called because you were worried, which is exactly what a good son does. Her voice was steady, but it had something in it now, something that surfaced when she said the word son, a thickness brief, controlled, and then gone. Pause. Yes, she said. Come home when you can, but not today. Today. She looked at the table around her. Today I have people. She hung up. She set the phone down. And then she did something that surprised the whole room. She laughed. Not a big laugh. Small and short and slightly incredulous. The laugh of someone who has looked at the full shape of the last 6 months from the outside for the first time and found it absurd not in a funny way, but in the way that certain enormous things are absurd where the scale of it is so far outside anything you'd have predicted for your own life that laughter is the only response that fits. 6 months, she said, 6 months I've been managing this alone, and then this morning I sat down at this table and in 2 hours, she stopped, shook her head, started again. James would have laughed at me, she said. He would have said, Mom, you found the most complicated possible solution. Was there a simpler one? Iron Bear asked. Probably, Margaret said, but not one that would have worked. Iron Bear looked at her. Why's that? Because Daniel had already made the simple paths impossible, she said. He'd been working on it for 6 months. Family doctors documents money he'd put himself in every gap. The only way through was something he hadn't anticipated. She looked at Iron Bear with complete seriousness. He did not anticipate you. He should have, Hammer said from the counter. Nobody anticipates us, Torch said. That's sort of the point. It's not a point we usually make at breakfast, Big Mac said. But here we are. The laugh that came from Margaret then was fuller, more real, and it caught Vera off guard, and Vera laughed too, and then Torch laughed, and then even Preacher made a sound that was not a laugh, and the diner filled briefly with something warm and improbable, the laughter of people in the aftermath of something hard, which is its own particular kind of grace. Sarah's third call came in at 11:40. She'd stepped to the back of the diner to make it, and when she came back, her face was different, not alarmed, controlled in the specific way that attorneys control their faces when the information they're carrying is either very good or very bad, and they haven't decided yet how to present it. She sat down. She looked at Margaret. They found Daniel, she said. The room went still. Found him where? Iron Bear asked. Nashville, Sarah said. His office. He went directly from here to his office and started shredding documents. She paused. His paralegal, a young woman named Claire Norris, was the one who called it in. She walked into his office, saw what he was doing, walked back out, and called the DA's office directly. The table absorbed this. Claire, Margaret said softly. Claire Norris, Sarah said. She's been documenting his activity for 3 months. She has copies of correspondence, billing records, communication with the developer in Knoxville, communication with Dr. Marsh. Sarah set her pen down. She kept copies of everything on a personal drive she kept at home, because she suspected he might do exactly what he did this morning if things went wrong. She was building a case, Iron Bear said. She was protecting herself and preparing for the moment she could hand it off, Sarah said. She couldn't go to the police without losing her job and potentially her career. She needed someone else to move first, someone he couldn't predict. She looked at Margaret. When she heard he'd driven to Callaway this morning, she waited. When he came back to the office and started shredding, she moved. Margaret was looking at the table. She heard what he was doing because of me, Margaret said. She acted because of you, Sarah said. Yes. I gave her an opening. You gave her the moment she'd been waiting 3 months for, Sarah said. The weight of that settled over the table differently than anything else that morning. Not triumphant. Something more complex than triumph, the understanding of how many people had been quietly carrying the same weight from different angles, waiting for a thread to pull, and how Margaret's walk across a diner had pulled all of them at once. Iron Bear looked at the ceiling for a moment. The developer, he said, the one from Knoxville. In Claire's documentation, Sarah said, there are emails between Daniel and the developer confirming a commission arrangement. Daniel was to receive $80,000 upon successful completion of the property transfer. She paused. There's also a reference to 2 previous properties, other elderly owners, both transfers completed. He's done this before, Hammer said. At least twice, Sarah said. With different structures, different documentation, different doctors. The DA's office is pulling those cases now. Iron Bear looked at Margaret. Margaret was looking at a point somewhere above the table, somewhere in the middle distance, and her expression was the expression of a woman doing arithmetic, not numbers, but weight. The weight of 2 other people who had not walked toward the thing when they should have, or who had not had the chance to, or who had simply not had a diner full of people willing to be their family for a morning. They lost their homes, Margaret said, not a question. Yes, Sarah said, because of the same structure he tried to use on me. A variation of it, Sarah said. He learns, he adjusts, he got better each time. Until this time, Iron Bear said. Until this time, Sarah said. Margaret put both hands flat on the table. She looked at them. Then she looked up. I want to help them, she said. The other two, whatever they need. Testimony, documentation, whatever an 89-year-old woman can do from Callaway, Tennessee, I'll do it. Sarah looked at her for a moment. You understand this is going to take time, she said, and it's going to be difficult. He'll have lawyers. He'll fight. He's been fighting for 6 months, Margaret said. I'm rested. Preacher at the counter said, she just said she's rested. And the sound he made then was definitely a laugh. Ellen arrived at 12:43. She was 58 years old and she had her mother's posture and her father's coloring, and she came through the door of the Rusty Spoon like a woman who had driven from Chattanooga in the kind of focused, furious love that forgets to stop for red lights. She found her mother in the corner booth, and she stopped in the middle of the diner, and she looked at her at the blue cardigan and the silver hair and the straight back, and something in her face collapsed and rebuilt itself all at once. She crossed the diner, and she sat down across from her mother, and she reached across the table and took both of Margaret's hands in hers. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then you should have called me. I called you when I was ready, Margaret said. That's not the same thing. No, Margaret said. It isn't, but it was what I needed. Ellen looked at her mother's hands in hers. She looked at the table, at Sarah's legal pad, at the empty coffee cups, at the closed leather folder. Then she became aware of the rest of the room. She looked at Vera behind the counter, at Big Mac finishing his third cup of coffee, at Preacher and Torch and Stone and Hammer arranged around the space, at Iron Bear sitting at the counter 2 stools down, who had noticed her come in and was giving her and her mother the room they needed by keeping his eyes on his cup. Ellen looked at the leather vests, at the patches. She looked long enough to read what the patches said. Then she looked at her mother. These are your friends, she said. These are my people, Margaret said. Ellen looked at Iron Bear's back. Which one is Rex? She asked quietly. Margaret's eyes moved to him. The one at the counter. Ellen got up. She walked to the counter. She sat down next to Iron Bear, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and then she said without any preface, without any of the careful social geometry that such moments usually require, thank you for sitting next to her. Iron Bear looked at her. She sat next to me, he said. Ellen blinked. She came to us, Iron Bear said. We just stayed. Ellen pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry in the Rusty Spoon diner. She was clearly making this decision in real time with effort. She told you about James, Ellen asked. She did. He would have liked you, Ellen said. She stopped searching. He had a very good sense of who was real. She has the same sense, Iron Bear said. Ellen looked at her mother across the diner. Margaret was talking to Sarah again, pointing at something on the legal pad, fully engaged, fully present, 89 years old, and running at full capacity. She really is fine, Ellen said, not surprised. Relieved in the way you're relieved when something you hoped was true turns out to actually be true. She was never not fine, Iron Bear said. She just needed the room to change. Ellen looked at him. She said something like that, Ellen said. On the phone, she paused. She said she needed someone who wouldn't flinch. That's all we did, Iron Bear said. We didn't flinch. That was enough, Ellen said. This morning, Iron Bear said, it was everything. At 1:15, Sarah's phone rang. She looked at the screen, looked up at the room, answered it. She listened for 45 seconds. She said when she listened, said confirmed. She listened again, said thank you, and hung up. She stood up. Daniel Pierce was arrested at his Nashville office at 12:52, she said, charged with elder financial abuse fraud, document falsification, and theft by exploitation. Dr. Franklin Marsh was picked up at his home in Brentwood at 1:07. Claire Norris is with the DA's office giving a full statement. The Rusty Spoon diner was silent. Then Torch said, okay, and the exhale that came with it contained the whole morning. Hammer put both hands flat on the counter and looked at them. Stone stood up straight and then sat back down, which was the most animated Iron Bear had seen him since they left Kentucky that morning. Big Mac said, you want another cup of coffee, Vera? Vera said, I think I want something stronger, and then laughed at herself. Iron Bear looked at Margaret. Margaret was looking at Sarah. Both of them, she said. Both, Sarah confirmed. And the other two, the other families. The cases are being reopened today, Sarah said. With Claire's documentation and your testimony, there's a real path to recovery for them, and I won't promise anything yet, but there's a real path. Margaret sat with that. She sat with it the way she sat with most things, straight-backed, clear-eyed, giving it the full weight of her attention without letting it knock her off her foundation. And then she said something that nobody in the room expected. Robert built that house in 1963, she said. He poured the foundation himself, bought the land with money he saved for 8 years working at the mill. He planted a walnut tree in the backyard the year our first child was born. She looked at Sarah. That tree is 61 years old. It's taller than the house. She paused. Daniel was going to put a subdivision on top of it. Nobody said anything. I want to go home, Margaret said. I want to go home and sit in my yard and look at Robert's tree. Iron Bear stood up from the counter. He looked at his table, his people. He said, pack up. They walked out of the Rusty Spoon Diner at 1:34 in the afternoon, 4.5 hours after they'd walked in looking for coffee and ended up somewhere else entirely. Margaret walked out between Iron Bear and Ellen, and behind them came Sarah with the leather folder void useless, stripped of its authority tucked under her arm. Behind her came Vera, who had decided she was taking her break whether Gerald liked it or not, because she was not going to stay inside while this particular procession left the building. And behind Vera came 6 bikers in the February cold sleeveless. Despite it, because February in Tennessee had never slowed any of them down before, and it wasn't going to start today. In the parking lot, Margaret stopped. She turned around and she looked at them, all of them, Vera and Sarah, and the 6 men with their vests, and their road names, and their particular impossible, improbable presence in a Tuesday morning that had begun like every other and ended like nothing else she would ever live through. I owe all of you something, she said, and I don't know what it is yet, but I want you to know I'm aware of it. You don't owe us anything, Torch said. You gave us a good story, Big Mac said. We were going to be bored all the way to Memphis. Memphis, Margaret said. That's where you were headed. Still are, Iron Bear said. Margaret looked at him. Will you, Mum? She stopped, started again. Will you come back through Callaway on your way back? Iron Bear looked at the road, at the mountains in the distance that never got any closer no matter how far you drove. At the woman standing in the February cold, who had been the bravest person in the room all morning by a margin that wasn't close. Yeah, he said, we'll come back through. Good, Margaret said. I make a very good pot roast. Stone said from the back, we'll be back on Thursday. Everyone looked at him. He'd said more words in that sentence than he'd said all morning. Thursday, Iron Bear said. Stone shrugged. Yogged. Pot roast. Margaret smiled. Not the controlled, composed expression she'd worn all morning, the real thing. Wide and warm and entirely herself. Thursday, she said. The house on Sycamore Road. Robert's walnut tree in the backyard. You can't miss it. She took Ellen's arm. She walked toward Ellen's car. Iron Bear watched her go. And in the pocket of his hand, his phone was warm from where he'd been holding it for the last 20 minutes. The screen showing a contact he hadn't called in 3 years. The call not yet made, but the decision already somewhere close to made the distance between almost and actually smaller than it had been since morning. He climbed onto his bike. The engine turned over. The others mounted up around him. And the Rusty Spoon Diner watched them go. The cook at the window, Vera in the door. The man in the John Deere cap standing in the parking lot for no reason he could have explained. Watched the 7 motorcycles pull out onto the 2-lane highway and ride toward Memphis in the February cold, and felt the strange, specific, not quite nameable feeling of having been present for something that mattered. And that would not come again. They made it to Memphis by 5 a.m. They stayed one night in a motel off the highway where the ice machine down the hall ran all night, and nobody complained about it because none of them were sleeping particularly well anyway. Iron Bear lay on top of the covers in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about a walnut tree that was 61 years old and taller than the house it stood behind, and about a man named Robert Whitmore, who had poured a foundation with his own hands and saved for 8 years to buy the land under it, and about what it meant that a stranger had almost erased all of that with a pen and a leather folder and a borrowed smile. He thought about his son. He thought about the phone in his pocket and the contact on the screen, and the 3 years of distance that had accumulated the way debt accumulates, not all at once, not in a single decisive moment, but in small failures of courage that added up to something large enough to feel permanent even when it wasn't. At 2 in the morning, he picked up the phone. He didn't call, not yet. He just held it. But he didn't put it back down either, and that was different from every other night in 3 years, and he noticed the difference, and he let himself notice it, which was also different. At 2:47, he set the phone on the nightstand face up. At 3:12, he picked it up again. He pressed call. It rang 4 times. He was ready for voicemail. He had prepared something to say, to voicemail something short and plain and without too much weight in it, because the first message after 3 years cannot carry everything that needs to eventually be said. It can only open a door. His son answered, "Dad." One word, just the one word. But the way it came out, not hostile, not cold, not the carefully neutral tone of a man who has rehearsed his distance, the way it came out, was the voice of someone who had been waiting in some interior room they'd never fully closed off for exactly this. "Yeah," Iron Bear said. "It's me." Silence. Not angry silence. The silence of two people on either side of something large figuring out which one of them is going to take the first step across it. "It's 3 in the morning, his son said. "I know." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Iron Bear said. I met someone today, an old woman. She did something brave, and I kept thinking about it, and I couldn't sleep." A pause. "What did she do?" "She walked toward the thing that was going to hurt her, instead of waiting for it to reach her," Iron Bear said. "And it worked. And watching it made me think that I've been waiting for something instead of walking toward it for a long time." His son was quiet. 3 years is a long time to wait," Iron Bear said. "I'm done waiting." Another pause. Longer, Iron Bear held it. "Okay," his son said finally. The word was rough at the edges, the way words are rough when they're working against something that doesn't want to move. "Okay, Dad. I'll call you tomorrow," Iron Bear said, "at a reasonable hour." "Yeah," his son said, "call me tomorrow." Iron Bear hung up. He set the phone down. He looked at the ceiling. And then, for the first time in a very long time, he slept. They rode back through Callaway on Thursday. It was late afternoon, the February light going amber and thin, and the 2-lane highway bent west the way it always did, and the mountains sat in the distance the way they always did, close enough to touch, and never actually closer, no matter how far you drove. The Rusty Spoon Diner went by on their left, and Iron Bear saw, without slowing down, that the missing S on the sign was still missing, and somehow that was the most comforting thing he'd seen in 2 days. Sycamore Road was 6 blocks from the diner. The house on Sycamore Road was white-clappered with a covered porch in a garden bed along the front that was bare and brown in February, but had the organized dormancy of something that would come back spectacular in April. Iron Bear saw the walnut tree before he saw the house. It rose above the roof line from the backyard, 61 years of growth, reaching up through the February sky, bare and enormous, and absolutely undeniably permanent. He understood looking at it exactly what Margaret had meant. No subdivision, not this tree, not this yard, not this foundation that a man had poured with his own hands. They parked along the street, all 6 bikes in a row, which on Sycamore Road on a Thursday evening drew the attention of every person within eyeline, and there were more of them than you might expect, because word travels fast in a town of 4,000, and the word about Margaret Whitmore and the Hells Angels and the Tuesday morning at the Rusty Spoon had been traveling for 2 days. The front door opened before Iron Bear reached the porch steps. Ellen came out first, and behind her came a man in his late 50s, with Margaret's eyes and his father's build, Robert Jr., who had driven up from Phoenix the previous night, and who had been inside that house since 8 that morning, not knowing exactly what to say to his mother, and saying too much of it anyway. He saw Iron Bear, and he stopped on the porch. He looked at the vest, the patch, the man underneath both. Then he came down the steps and he put out his hand. "Robert Whitmore II," he said. "My mother told me what you did." Iron Bear shook his hand. "She did all of it herself." "That's what she said you'd say," Robert Jr. said. "She also said that's not entirely true." Iron Bear looked at him. "She said," Robert Jr. stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. "She said you sat next to her. That's what she keeps saying. She said you could have moved to another table and you sat next to her instead." "That's all it was," Iron Bear said. "For her, it was everything," Robert Jr. said. And his voice on the word everything had the particular texture of a man who has spent 2 days understanding the full shape of what almost happened and what he'd almost allowed to happen through nothing more than love handed by him to the wrong person. My father used to say that the most important thing a man can do is put his body between someone he loves and the thing that's coming for them. He looked at Iron Bear. You did that for my mother, a stranger. She stopped being a stranger about 30 seconds after she opened her mouth, Iron Bear said. Robert Jr. pressed his lips together. He nodded. He stepped back. And then the screen door opened and Margaret Whitmore came out onto her own porch in a different cardigan, this one yellow spring-colored optimistic. And she looked at the 6 men standing in her front yard and she said, well, you actually came. We said we would, Torch said. People say a lot of things, Margaret said. She came down the steps one at a time, holding the rail with the deliberate dignity of a woman who refuses to be rushed by her own body. Come around back, she said. I want to show you something before dinner. The walnut tree was everything. That was the only way to say it. It was everything. 61 years old, and the diameter of its trunk was wider than Iron Bear's arm span, and its bare branches in the February sky had the complex reaching architecture of something that has been growing toward light for longer than most of the people standing under it had been alive. The ground around its base was thick with the accumulated years' fallen husks, old leaves, the particular dark richness of soil that has been fed by the same tree for 6 decades. Margaret stood at the base of it with her hand flat against the bark. She didn't say anything for a moment. Neither did anyone else. Robert planted it the year Ellen was born, she said finally. He said every child deserves a tree. He meant to plant one for each of them, but the years got busy and this one got so big it seemed wrong to crowd it. She patted the bark once the way you pat the shoulder of someone you've known for 60 years. Daniel's developer was going to take this whole yard, the house, the garden, the tree. She turned to look at Iron Bear. He called it a depreciating asset. In the email Claire gave to Sarah, that's what he called it, a depreciating asset. Stone, standing at the back of the group, said, he was wrong about that. Margaret looked at him. Stone almost never volunteered anything, and everyone around him knew it, and the weight his words carried because of that was considerable. He was wrong about that, Margaret agreed, about several things. She walked them back inside after that, and the house on Sycamore Road received 6 Hell's Angels, the way houses receive people when the person who keeps them has a generous spirit. Every surface had something on it that told you who lived there, photographs and small ceramic figures and books with broken spines and a quilt on the back of the sofa that had been there so long it had become part of the sofa's identity. It smelled like pot roast and something baking and coffee and wood smoke from a fireplace that had been burning since morning. Torch stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at the photographs on the wall. Decades of them, children growing up through the years, family gathered at tables and on porches, and at what appeared to be the same walnut tree, at different stages of its life. And he said, how many grandchildren? 7, Margaret called from the kitchen. And 2 great-grandchildren. Though one of the great-grandchildren I haven't met yet, he's 3 months old and his parents are in Germany. Military. You'll meet him, Torch said. I intend to, Margaret said. Dinner was served at the dining room table that fit 12 when the leaves were in, and with 6 bikers and Margaret and Ellen and Robert Jr., it fit everyone with room for the pot roast and the corn and the biscuits that had been baking since the smell hit them at the door. Big Mac ate 3 biscuits before the pot roast was served and did not apologize. Margaret refilled everyone's water glass, personally moving around the table with the quiet authority of a woman in her own home, and she did not let anyone help her with it, and nobody pushed. Robert Jr. sat across from Iron Bear, and somewhere between the first biscuit and the second helping of pot roast, he told Iron Bear about Phoenix, about the engineering firm. He ran about his daughter who was pre-med and his son who wanted to be a carpenter, about the drive up from the airport that took him through the edge of Callaway and how he'd seen the Rusty Spoon sign and pulled into the lot and sat there for a while just looking at the building. I kept thinking, Robert Jr. said that I drove past here 1,000 times growing up. We used to stop in there after church, me and James and Ellen. He looked at his plate. And then I thought about my mom sitting in that corner booth on Tuesday morning and what was coming for her and what she did about it. He shook his head. She never told any of us how bad it had gotten. 6 months and she handled it alone. She didn't want to frighten you, Iron Bear said. She's 89 years old, Robert Jr. said. We're supposed to be frightening things away from her, not the other way around. She'd push back on that, Iron Bear said. I know she would, Robert Jr. said. That's what James used to say. He used to say Mom's going to outlast all of us just to prove a point. Something moved across his face. He was right too. She would have. She still might, Iron Bear said. Robert Jr. looked at him and then laughed short and genuine. She really might. After dinner, when Ellen and Robert Jr. had moved to the kitchen, and Hammer and Stone and Big Mac were discussing something at one end of the table that seemed to involve a road trip disagreement from 2019 that hadn't been fully resolved. Margaret and Iron Bear sat at the other end of the table with coffee and the particular quiet of two people who have been through something together and don't need to reconstruct it to share the weight of it. Sarah called this morning, Margaret said. Good news or complicated news? Both, Margaret said. Daniel's arraignment is set for next Thursday. He's been denied bail because the DA argued flight risk. She held her cup. The other two families, the ones he did this to before me, a woman in Murfreesboro named Frances Doyle, and a man in Cookville named Harold Webb. Sarah says the DA is now looking at recovery options for both of them. It's not certain, but there's a path. Frances and Harold, Iron Bear said. Frances is 83, Margaret said. She lost her house 8 months ago. She's been living with her daughter since. Harold is 79. He lost a commercial property, a hardware store his father started in 1951. She set her cup down. I keep thinking about them, about the Tuesday morning they needed and didn't have. They have it now, Iron Bear said, because you had yours. Margaret looked at the table. Do you believe things happen for reasons? No, Iron Bear said. I believe people make choices and those choices knock into other choices. And sometimes you end up somewhere that feels like it was meant to be but wasn't. It was just the result of a long chain of someone deciding to do the right thing even when it was hard. Margaret looked at him. That's a very specific answer for a question most people just say yes to. Most people find yes easier, Iron Bear said. What choice started this change, she asked. He thought about it. Probably Claire Norris putting that card in your mailbox. Before that, Margaret said. She put it there because she'd been watching for 3 months and she thought I was worth saving. Why did she think that? Iron Bear looked at her. Because you're the kind of person who comes in every Tuesday and leaves a $4 tip on a $7 tab, he said. Because Vera knew your name and your book and your coffee and had known it for 11 years. Because the people around you knew you well enough to notice when something changed. He paused. You built that over a long time. You built a life that made people want to protect you. Margaret was quiet for a moment. And you, she said, what choice did you make? I ordered coffee, he said. She shook her head. Before that, the choice that made you the kind of person who, when a strange old woman walked across a room towards you, didn't look away. He didn't answer immediately. Outside in the backyard, the walnut tree stood in the February dark, and the wind moved through its bare branches with a sound like something very old and very patient, being asked a question it had already answered 1,000 times. My mother died when I was 9, Iron Bear said. She was sick for 2 years before that. And when she was sick, there was a neighbor, a man. He used to stop by, bring groceries, fix things around the house. He didn't know us well. He stopped. He was just a man who decided that a woman and a child who were struggling shouldn't have to struggle alone. He looked at his coffee cup. I've been trying to be that man my whole life, some days better than others. You were him on Tuesday, Margaret said. We all were, Iron Bear said. Every one of us. Yes, Margaret said, but you sat down first. The kitchen sounds drifted through from the other room. Ellen laughing at something Robert Jr. said, the particular bright noise of family in a kitchen after a good meal, the sound of a house being fully inhabited by people who love each other and know it. Torch appeared in the doorway, took one look at the table correctly, assessed that whatever was happening between the two people that's sitting there was not to be interrupted, and retreated without a word. How's your son? Margaret asked. Iron Bear looked up. We talked, he said, Wednesday night, 3 a.m. And we're going to talk again, he said, tomorrow. Proper time of day. Margaret smiled, not the controlled version, the real one, warm and wide. Good, she said. That's very good. He lives in Portland now, Iron Bear said. Works in a hospital. He paused. He's a social worker. Works with elderly patients, people who don't have family nearby. Margaret looked at him. He takes care of people who are alone, she said. He always had that in him, Iron Bear said. I didn't always make it easy for him to show it around me. Then it's good you called, Margaret said. It is, Iron Bear said, and he said it plainly without qualification with the straightforward ownership of a man who has made peace with the distance between who he was and who he is trying to become. The twist that changed everything about what Thursday became didn't come from Iron Bear or from Margaret. It came from Hammer of all people who had been uncharacteristically quiet through dinner and whose silence had a different quality to it than Stone's silence, not the silence of a man who had nothing to say, but the silence of a man who had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. After dinner, when this table was being cleared, and Ellen was doing the thing where she kept finding reasons to be in the same room as the bikers because she was clearly fascinated and clearly trying not to show it, Hammer pulled Iron Bear aside in the hallway. I made a call, Hammer said. Iron Bear looked at him. While you were in Memphis Tuesday night, Hammer said, I made a call. To who? Hammer looked at the floor. For a man of his size and his history, the looking at the floor had a particular quality, not shame, but the specific discomfort of someone doing something unfamiliar with their own feelings. My sister, Hammer said. She's 71, lives alone in Knoxville, widowed 6 years. He stopped. I call her on her birthday, Christmas. That's been it for the last few years. He rubbed the back of his neck. I called her Tuesday night, and I talked to her for 2 hours. She cried, not sad crying, the other kind. Iron Bear said nothing. He let Hammer have the room. She told me some things, Hammer said, about her situation, about some of what she's been managing alone. He looked up. Some of it was financial. Some people had been at her about some things. Nothing like Daniel Pierce, but the beginning of something that looked like it could get there. He met Iron Bear's eyes. I didn't know, because I wasn't calling, because I told myself she was fine, because that was easier than checking. Iron Bear looked at him. She's fine now, he asked. She's got her son close by, Hammer said. He's handling it. But if he hadn't been, he stopped. I'm going to see her on the way back. Next week. I'm going to stop in Knoxville. Good, Iron Bear said. I kept thinking about what Margaret said, Hammer continued, that Daniel spent 6 months making her feel isolated because isolated people sign things, because isolated people don't fight back. He shook his head. My sister isn't isolated, but I was letting her be lonelier than she needed to be. Margaret did this to you, Iron Bear said. Not a question. She walked across a room toward the thing that was going to hurt her, Hammer said. And I thought, how long have I been on the wrong side of that room from the people who needed me to walk toward them? Iron Bear put a hand on Hammer's shoulder, briefly, firmly. Knoxville is 2 hours from here, Iron Bear said. We can go Tuesday. Hammer looked at him. We're already going out of the way. Knoxville, Iron Bear said. Tuesday. That's done. Hammer nodded. His jaw worked for a moment, and then he nodded again, and that was the end of the conversation, both of them knowing that everything important had been said, and that saying it again would only make it smaller. They went back to the living room. At 9 o'clock, when the evening had wound down to the natural end of itself, Margaret sitting in the armchair by the fireplace, Ellen and Robert Jr. on the sofa, the 6 bikers distributed around the room, in the particular relaxed stillness of people who have stopped being guests and started being something. Without a clean name, Robert Jr. said the thing that had clearly been building in him since dinner. I want to do something, he said, for Francis Doyle and Harold Webb. Margaret looked at him. I've been sitting here all night thinking about them, he said. A woman who lost her house 8 months ago. A man who lost his father's hardware store. He leaned forward. I have resources. I run a firm. I have connections in Tennessee, property law, because we've done work here. He looked at Sarah's card on the end table where Margaret had placed it. I want to talk to Sarah. I want to know what can actually be done. Not what the legal system might do eventually, what can be done now by people who decide to do it. Margaret looked at her son. That's your father talking, she said. He had the same thing in him. He'd hear about something unjust, and he couldn't sit with it. He had to move. Can't imagine where I got it, Robert Jr. said. You got it honestly, Margaret said, from a man who poured his own foundation and planted his own tree. Robert Jr. pulled out his phone and texted Sarah Henley at 9:15 on a Thursday night, and Sarah Henley, who had apparently been expecting the call, based on everything she knew about Margaret Whitmore's family, answered in 4 minutes. Iron Bear watched this happen from the other end of the room and felt something settle in his chest, not pride, not satisfaction, but something quieter and more lasting than either. The particular feeling of watching a thing that was started by an act of courage continue forward under its own momentum, reaching further than the person who started it ever could have reached alone. Margaret caught him watching. She looked at him from her armchair with the firelight on her face and her silver hair and her yellow cardigan, and she said across the room, "What are you thinking? That you started something," he said. "We started something," she said. "No," he said, "you started it. We were just there when it needed to be started." Margaret shook her head. "You keep trying to give it back to me." "Because it's yours," Iron Bear said. "You walked across a room full of strangers who scared you and asked for help out loud. That's the hardest thing most people never do." He looked at her steadily. "Everything that happened after that happened because you did that." The fire made its sounds. Outside the window, the winter dark held the yard and the porch and the enormous walnut tree standing in its own quiet authority over everything. "I asked for a son for one day," Margaret said. "I know. I should clarify something about that," she said. Iron Bear looked at her. "When I walked across that diner," she said, "I didn't actually know what I was going to buy. I knew I needed help. I knew I was out of time. I knew that the only people in that building who Daniel Pierce could not predict, could not intimidate, could not fold with paperwork, were you." She paused. "The sun thing that just came out. Because I was looking at you and you reminded me of James. Not how you look. Something else. The way you looked at the room. Like you were already thinking about what needed protecting." Iron Bear was quiet. "James used to walk into a room like that," she said, "looking for what needed taking care of. I used to tease him about it. I'd say, 'James, you can't fix everything.' And he'd say, 'I know, Mom, but I can fix this one.'" Her voice stayed even, but the firelight caught something in her eyes. "You walked into the Rusty Spoon on Tuesday morning, and you looked at the room the same way he did." Iron Bear said nothing for a long moment. "I'm sorry he's gone," he said finally. "He'd have liked you enormously," Margaret said. "He'd have had 1,000 questions, and he'd have ridden one of those motorcycles whether any of you offered or not." She smiled at the memory. "He was like that." "Sounds like someone else I know," Torch said from across the room. "Don't push it," Iron Bear said. Tete. What happened over the months that followed was not a single dramatic event, but an accumulation of ordinary ones, which is how the most important things tend to happen. Daniel Pierce pled guilty in April to 3 counts of elder financial abuse and 2 counts of document fraud. His law license was revoked the same week. Dr. Franklin Marsh surrendered his medical license as part of a negotiated settlement and cooperated with investigators who were looking at 5 additional cases across 3 states. Claire Norris received a commendation from the Tennessee Attorney General's office and was hired by a nonprofit legal organization that defended elderly clients against financial exploitation, where she turned out to be extraordinary at the work because she already knew exactly how the other side operated. Frances Doyle got her house back. It took 4 months, and Robert Jr.'s connections and Sarah Henley working what Iron Bear suspected were some very long hours. But in June, Frances Doyle walked back into the house in Murfreesboro she'd lost 8 months earlier, and her daughter was there, and her grandchildren were there, and the neighbors who'd watched her leave came to welcome her back. Sarah called Margaret the night it happened. Margaret sat by the fireplace and listened to the whole story, and when she hung up, she sat alone in the quiet of her living room for a while, not sad, not exactly happy either. Something that was larger than happiness. Something that knew its own name. Harold Webb's hardware store was more complicated. The property had changed hands twice and the legal recovery was not fully possible. But Robert Jr.'s firm structured a settlement that gave Harold Webb enough to open a smaller store in the same town, and Harold did open it 2 months later and named it Webb's, the same name his father had used in 1951, and put a photograph of the original store in the window, and was open 6 days a week by 7 in the morning, because that was when his father had opened, and some things are worth keeping exactly as they were. Margaret went to the opening. She drove herself, which Ellen didn't love but accepted, because you did not tell Margaret Whitmore what she could and couldn't drive to, not at 89, not ever. She shook Harold Webb's hand and she told him what she knew about his case, and he said, "I heard about you. You're the woman in Callaway." And she said, I'm one of several people in Callaway. Most of them are considerably larger than me. And Harold Webb laughed, and Margaret bought a box of finishing nails she had absolutely no use for, because you buy something when you walk into a man's father's hardware store and it's open again. They came back every few weeks, not every week. They had lives, roots, obligations. The open road doesn't wait for anyone, and a Hells Angels chapter president has responsibilities that don't pause because he found an old woman who made extraordinary pot roast. But they came back often enough that Vera at the Rusty Spoon started putting the big middle booth on hold on the days she knew they were coming, and the man in the John Deere cap started timing his breakfast to overlap with theirs because he liked the company, and Gerald the cook started making extra biscuits because Big Mac had made his position on biscuits abundantly clear. Robert Jr. flew in from Phoenix twice in the first 4 months. Ellen started driving up from Chattanooga on alternate weekends, which was more than she'd been doing before, and she knew why it was more, and she didn't try to pretend it was coincidence. Torch and Margaret exchanged phone numbers. He didn't know exactly how it happened. She just had his phone in her hand and was typing before he registered what was occurring, and he called her once a week, sometimes twice, on no particular schedule, just to talk. And she asked about his week and his life and the road and the things that kept him up at night, and she listened the way that only people who have lived long enough to know what listening costs ever really listen. And Torch found himself saying things on those calls that he hadn't said to anyone. One Tuesday in May, Iron Bear rode to Callaway alone. He came to the Rusty Spoon. Vera brought coffee without asking. He sat in the corner booth. Margaret was already there, book open, just as she had been every Tuesday for 11 years, except that now when the door opened, she didn't flinch. She looked up. She said, "You're early." "I was in the area," he said. "You're never just in the area," she said. "Callaway is not on the way to anywhere." "I wanted to talk," he said. She closed her book. "My son is coming to Memphis in June," he said. "He's taking a week. We're going to—" He stopped, started again. "We're going to figure some things out, some things that should have been figured out a long time ago." "Good," Margaret said. "I wanted you to know," he said, "because you said to try wearing, and I tried, and it's—" He looked at the table. "It's not fixed. It's just open again. But open is better than closed." "Open is everything," Margaret said. "Closed is where things go to die. Open is where they come back." Iron Bear looked at her. "You know," he said, "for someone who asked me to be her son, for one day you give very mother-level advice." Margaret looked at him over her coffee cup. "I've had 60 years of practice," she said, "and you're not hard to read. People generally think I'm very hard to read. People generally aren't paying attention," she said. He almost smiled. It got most of the way there. Vera refilled both their coffees. She didn't say anything. She'd learned that some things were better received without commentary. They sat in the corner booth of the Rusty Spoon Diner on a Tuesday in May, the old woman and the biker, and outside the window, Callaway went about its morning with the unhurried quality of a small town that knows it isn't going anywhere and has made its peace with that, and the mountains in the distance were still the same mountains that never got any closer, no matter how far you drove, and the sign on the diner still said RUTYPOO, because nobody had replaced the S, and probably nobody ever would. And it was enough. It was exactly enough. The last time Iron Bear saw Margaret Whitmore fully and completely herself was on a Saturday in October, almost 8 months after the Tuesday that changed everything. All 6 of them were there. They'd ridden in the night before and slept in the 2 spare rooms and on the sofa and on an air mattress that Big Mac had brought, because he'd learned from the previous visit that the air mattress was better than the sofa if you were his particular size. Ellen was there. Robert Jr. had flown in. 2 of Margaret's grandchildren that had driven up from Nashville, teenagers who had been told about the Hells Angels in their grandmother's kitchen and who could not decide whether to be impressed or alarmed, and landed on both simultaneously. Margaret made breakfast for 12 people without accepting assistance, and then they all sat in the backyard under the walnut tree, which in October wore its color magnificently, the kind of color that makes you understand why people drive hours to see it, and they ate and they talked, and the teenagers eventually decided impressed was the better option, and started asking Torch about the bikes with the focused interrogation of people who have wanted to ask something for 2 hours and finally decided to just ask. Margaret sat in the yard chair that Robert Jr. had brought out for her, and she looked at her walnut tree and at the people around it, her children and her grandchildren, and the 6 men who had sat with her through the worst morning of her final years and stayed past it into the ordinary and extraordinary days that came after, and something in her face was settled in a way that Iron Bear had not seen it settled, not even on the Tuesday when it was all over. More settled than relief, more complete than safety. He sat down next to her. James would have been here today, she said. He'd have taken over the cooking, and he'd have insisted on showing those boys the engine on one of the bikes. And he'd have been absolutely insufferable about it, and it would have been perfect. Tell me something else about him, Iron Bear said. So she did. She told him about James as a child, stubborn and curious, and always fixing things that weren't broken to understand how they worked. She told him about James at 30, starting a construction company with borrowed tools and paying back every cent. She told him about James at 55, driving 2 hours to fix his mother's porch roof without being asked because he'd heard from Ellen that it needed doing. She told him about the last conversation she'd had with him, ordinary, about a football game and a recipe for soup, and how she was glad in the end that the last thing they'd talked about was nothing special. Because nothing special is what most of love is made of if you're paying attention. Iron Bear listened to all of it. When she was done, she looked at the tree. I asked for a son for one day, she said. I know, Iron Bear said. I want you to know something, she said. She turned and looked at him directly with the full force of 89 years of paying attention and knowing what mattered and saying it clearly. What you gave me was not a performance of family. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. She held his gaze. You walked into my worst day and you stayed in it with me. That's what family does. That's the whole definition of it. Not blood, not paperwork, not obligation. She looked at the tree and then back at him. You 6 are family to me, chosen and therefore permanent. Iron Bear looked at the walnut tree. He looked at the yard full of people. He looked at the woman in the chair next to him. Silver-haired, straight-backed yellow cardigan, replaced today with a deep red one. Pearl buttons still even, still herself, still completely and entirely herself. We protect family, he said. Margaret smiled. I asked for a son for one day, she said, and I got 6 for the rest of my life. Iron Bear looked at her. That's right, he said, and he meant it the way you mean things that have stopped being decisions and become simply true. The way the tree is true, and the foundation is true, and the mountains in the distance are true, always there, always exactly where they are, whether you drive toward them or not. And in the yard on Sycamore Road, under a walnut tree that a man named Robert Whitmore had planted 61 years ago, because every child deserves a tree, the family that Margaret Whitmore had chosen, and that had chosen her back in a diner on a Tuesday morning when everything was on the line, sat together in the October light. And that was enough. That was everything.